Imagine this. A journalist digs too deep into local corruption, and suddenly she's treated like a traitor. Mary thought she was exposing shady deals and stolen taxpayer money, but the government called it a state secret. Overnight, she went from reporter to prisoner. Locked inside, she realized the truth hadn't died with her trial. Her colleagues still had the real documents. Through hidden letters scratched out in fear of discovery, she reached beyond prison walls. And when the files finally hit the public, the country shook. Her story is about betrayal, courage, and what happens when speaking the truth becomes a crime. If you're into raw, real human dramas that cut close to the bone, make sure to subscribe because this one will stay with you. I used to think the worst thing about being a reporter was the late nights in front of a screen that burned your eyes or the calls that never got returned. I was wrong. The worst thing is hearing your own name read out in a courtroom like you're a suspect in a murder. My stomach twisted when the prosecutor's voice sliced through the wood-paneled air. Unauthorized disclosure of classified information, damage to national security, potential risk to public safety. I wanted to laugh, but my mouth was too dry. They were talking about me, a local journalist who barely had enough followers to fill a bus, who spent most of her time begging clerks at City Hall to stamp documents. The story that started it all was about road contracts and construction scams. Bridges that shook when trucks rolled across them. Schools that failed inspections before the paint even dried. Invoices that doubled overnight without explanation. I filed requests, dug through receipts, followed paper trails that anyone with patience and caffeine could trace. And then, buried in the bureaucratic mess, I found something different, emails that weren't supposed to see daylight. They had been marked confidential, though the only secret they held was how openly public money had been diverted into private pockets. I published it, thinking it was just another piece in the endless puzzle of corruption. The backlash came faster than the story had spread. First, anonymous calls telling me I'd gone too far. Then, my editor whispering in the office hallway that there were concerns at the federal level. By the time the FBI knocked on my apartment door, I was too stunned to even close my laptop. They took everything, hard drives, notebooks, even the flash drive where I kept my unfinished drafts. They didn't care about context. They just cared about a stamp that said, sensitive, and a headline with my byline under it. At trial, I sat in silence while they twisted every choice I'd made into something sinister. The jury didn't see a journalist, they saw a liability. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was years. And the air inside that courtroom suddenly felt thinner than in any prison cell I'd ever imagined. My parents sat behind me, trying not to cry. My friends avoided eye contact. My editor never showed up. I was alone, branded as the woman who betrayed her country by showing it the truth. On the bus to prison, I stared out the window at the world I'd written about for years. The cracked sidewalks, the neon signs over diners, the graffiti that spoke louder than city councils. It all looked the same, but I wasn't the same. The title journalist had been stripped from me like an old coat, replaced with a number on a badge I would soon be forced to wear. I thought my career was over, my voice silenced. What I didn't know was that the real story was just beginning, and that even behind bars, I'd still find ways to be heard. Prison is not like the movies. There's no dramatic background music, no sudden fistfights every day. It's quieter, more suffocating. The noise is constant but meaningless. Doors clanging, guards barking, women yelling at each other over things so small you'd laugh if you weren't already drained. The real punishment isn't the routine. It's the shrinking of yourself, the way you learn to move smaller, talk less, become invisible just to survive. First, I thought I'd disappear. I tried to keep my head down, counting days and avoiding eye contact. But invisibility doesn't last when your name has already been plastered across headlines. Some inmates called me CNN, others the spy. They didn't understand my case, but they understood I was different. That kind of attention is dangerous in here. Then one day, during mail call, I got a letter from someone I hadn't expected. Daniel, a colleague I'd worked with for years. We weren't close, just two reporters crossing paths in the newsroom, sharing lukewarm coffee and sarcastic jokes about deadlines. His handwriting was messy, his words carefully plain, but hidden between the lines was something else. A hint, a suggestion. He still had the documents. Not copies of what I'd published, but the full cache. The ones I hadn't even touched because I knew they'd burn me alive if I did. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke. Why would he keep them? Why tell me now when I was already buried? But as I read the letter again and again, the meaning sharpened. He was telling me he could finish what I'd started. He just needed my guidance, my push from the inside. That realization hit me harder than the sentence ever did. I wasn't done. The story wasn't dead. The challenge was how to respond without the guards catching on. Every letter was opened, scanned, read by people who didn't care about journalism or corruption, only about making sure nothing dangerous slipped through. So I had to invent codes. I wrote about recipes, meaning files. I mentioned unfinished stories, meaning leads. It was clumsy at first, like two kids inventing a secret language, but it worked. Slowly, letter by letter, I started helping Daniel connect dots he couldn't see from the outside. It gave me something I hadn't had since the trial: purpose. I stopped drifting through the days. I started watching the world again, listening to conversations, noticing the cracks in the system around me. Inmates talk, guards talk, and corruption doesn't stop at the prison gates. The patterns I saw inside mirrored the same rot I'd written about outside. The difference now was that my reporting didn't appear in print. It lived inside coded sentences on lined paper, passed under the noses of people who thought they'd already silenced me. But every secret shared carried risk. If they caught the code, Daniel would be exposed, and I'd face consequences worse than solitary. Some nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was dragging him down with me. Other nights I thought about what would happen if he actually published everything. The chaos, the retaliation, the weight of truth finally unleashed. Fear and hope tangled together in my chest until I couldn't tell them apart. What I knew for sure was that I wasn't alone anymore. There was still a fight, still a chance. And that fragile thread of connection, scribbled in ink, became my lifeline in a place built to strip you of everything human. The first time I realized our letters had power was when a guard smirked at me during mail call. He tossed the envelope like it was a joke, like he knew something I didn't. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting a warning or a blank page. Instead, Daniel had written a single sentence that made my pulse race. "The recipe is starting to smell." That was our code for exposure. He was digging deeper, connecting threads between the fake contracts, the shell companies, and the politicians I couldn't name in open court. Terrified me. Not just the risk of him being discovered, but the fact that he was actually doing it. Part of me wanted to scream at him to stop, to shred everything and save himself. But another part, the part that had driven me into this mess in the first place, felt alive again. We weren't just passing time with coded notes. We were moving closer to something explosive. I sharpened the codes. I talk about ingredients in recipes when I meant evidence. A missing step in the instructions meant a missing link in the chain. When I wrote about burning food, it meant urgency, that the story was about to break. Daniel played along, sending back lines that looked like rambling about dinners and groceries, but I could read the fire underneath. Inside prison, hope is dangerous. Other women held onto scraps of it. Appeals that never came, promises from boyfriends who stopped visiting, dreams of reunions that turned into years of silence. You learn not to hope too hard, because disappointment is just another kind of punishment. But these letters gave me something I couldn't smother. I began to imagine what would happen if Daniel really published the full story. Maybe the public would finally see me not as a criminal, but as someone who tried to hold the powerful accountable. Maybe my name wouldn't end with disgrace. But danger grows where you least expect it. One afternoon, I returned to my bunk and found my cellmate holding one of my letters, squinting at it like she was solving a puzzle. She wasn't supposed to touch my things. I felt cold all over. She laughed and said she couldn't make sense of my obsession with cooking. I forced a smile, but inside I was panicking. If she pressed harder, if she mentioned it to the wrong person, the code could unravel. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking of Daniel at his desk, typing with that messy concentration, maybe drinking cheap coffee while the world outside spun on. Did he understand the risk we were both carrying? Did he know that if this blew up in our faces, I'd take the fall twice over, and he might lose everything too? Weeks passed. More letters. More clues. The circle was closing. Daniel wrote that he'd traced money from the city contracts straight into offshore accounts tied to senators. The kind of people who didn't get touched, no matter how dirty their hands were. He was scared. I could feel it between his words. But he was committed. Then one letter came that made my skin prickle. "It's almost ready," he wrote. "The kitchen's about to go up in flames." I knew what he meant. He was going to publish. The days that followed were unbearable. Every time the guards walked past, I expected a hand on my shoulder, a search of my bunk, a trip to solitary. Every sound of keys, every slam of a door, made my heart lurch. I had wanted this, truth out in the open, but the weight of what it would mean pressed down like iron. And then, one morning, during routine checks, I noticed something different. Guards whispering to each other. The TV in the common room blaring news louder than usual. Faces turned toward the screen. My stomach flipped. Something had happened. I didn't know yet if it was freedom knocking or the storm about to swallow me whole. I didn't see the headline myself. In prison, you catch news like scraps tossed over a fence. Half sentences, whispers, the flicker of a TV you're not allowed to control. But that morning, I knew something had cracked open. The guards were restless, checking their phones more than usual. The women around me buzzed with energy, though most didn't even understand why. And then, through the blur of voices, I caught my name. My name, spoken like it suddenly belonged to the outside world again. Daniel had done it. He had published everything. Not just the contracts I had exposed, not just the memos that had put me on trial. He'd released the entire vault. Emails, invoices, financial transfers, communications that linked senators and corporate executives in a chain of theft so obvious a child could follow it. Offshore accounts, fake charities, private jets paid for by funds meant to fix schools with leaking roofs. And he didn't hide. He signed his name to the story. He'd chosen the fire. The prison common room turned into a strange theater. Inmates leaned forward as anchors on TV stumbled over words, their voices shaking with the weight of the scandal. It wasn't just local anymore, it was national, international. Politicians who had stood tall at my trial were suddenly on the defensive. The same people who called me reckless were now cornered, their excuses thin as paper. I wanted to scream with relief, but fear coiled tight in my gut, because if Daniel had blown the story wide open, that meant retaliation was coming. Against him, against me. The state doesn't forgive being embarrassed, not on that scale. The next few days blurred together. I was dragged into an office, interrogated again by officials who tried to pin Daniel's actions on me. They wanted to know how he got the documents, who I had contacted, whether I had orchestrated the leak from inside prison walls. I stared at the table, choosing silence over lies. If I said too much, Daniel would burn. If I said too little, they'd bury me deeper. Felt like standing on the edge of a blade. But the pressure didn't just come from them. Inside, inmates watched me differently. Some admired me, whispering that I was brave, that I'd stood up to people who crushed ordinary lives without consequence. Others resented me, jealous of the attention, worried I'd bring heat down on the whole block. Prison politics can kill you faster than any gavel. I learned to keep my face blank, my movements steady, while inside I was shaking apart. And then something I hadn't dared hope for happened. Protests outside. I saw it on the news. Crowds gathering with signs, chanting for my release, demanding accountability. My face on posters, my name turned into a hashtag. I had gone from traitor to symbol in a matter of days. The same country that had thrown me in a cell was suddenly calling me a hero. It was surreal, almost unbearable, to know the world was speaking my name again. The warden called me into her office. She looked at me with a mixture of disgust and resignation. She told me I'd be transferred, that it wasn't safe for me here anymore. I understood the subtext. The state had lost control of the narrative. Keeping me locked up now made them look worse. That night, back in my cell, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my heart hammering. For the first time since the trial, I felt something sharp and real cutting through the numbness. It wasn't hope exactly, It was the realization that freedom might be closer than I'd ever let myself believe. But freedom, I knew, came with a cost. And I had no idea what kind of world I'd step into once the bars finally opened. The day they opened the gate for me, the air outside felt heavier than I remembered, like freedom carried its own weight. Reporters crowded beyond the barriers, their cameras blinking like 100 unblinking eyes. I hadn't seen that many microphones since the day of my conviction, but this time the noise was different. It wasn't accusation, it was hunger. They wanted me to speak, to confirm that the story Daniel had detonated was true, to play the role they'd carved out for me. The journalist who had survived prison and come back as a symbol. I didn't speak that first day. I walked past the cameras, my head down, my body shaking as if the concrete beneath my feet might vanish. My parents were there, older, grayer, their eyes wet with relief and fear. They hugged me like I might slip away again. I felt both held and hollow. Daniel met me later, away from the flash of cameras. He looked worn out, older than I remembered, but his eyes carried the same fire I'd read between his messy sentences in those letters. He told me the fallout was bigger than either of us could have predicted. Senators resigning, contractors under federal investigation, whispers of reforms that sounded too good to be true. He said people were calling me the face of free press, the woman who stood against the machine and didn't break. But inside, I knew the truth was messier. I had broken. In prison, I'd cried into my pillow until my throat went raw. I thought about giving up, thought about shutting Daniel out, thought about disappearing inside myself forever. I wasn't a hero. I was just someone too stubborn to stay silent, even when silence might have been safer. The irony hit me hardest when I returned to my apartment, the same place where agents had stormed in and taken everything. The walls still smelled faintly of dust and neglect. My laptop was gone, my shelves half empty, but the silence was intact. I sat there, listening to the hum of the fridge, and realized freedom didn't erase the scars. It didn't erase the months stolen from me, the friendships that had withered, the trust that had been shattered. And yet, the world expected me to lead, to speak, to carry the banner. Invitations poured in for interviews, for conferences, for panels on press freedom. Every time I walked onto a stage, I carried the memory of the prison walls, the smell of bleach, the scrape of metal doors. I carried the fear that it could all happen again, to me or to someone else who dared to expose too much. The strangest part was seeing my own face on posters, on t-shirts, even spray-painted onto walls. A symbol, they called me. But symbols don't wake up sweating from prison nightmares. Symbols don't doubt themselves when the lights go off. I wasn't sure I wanted to be anyone's icon. I just wanted to keep telling the truth. When Daniel and I finally sat down to talk about the future, he asked if I'd keep reporting. My answer came out before I could think. Yes, because despite everything, I couldn't imagine living in silence. They had tried to bury me, but the truth had clawed its way out, louder than before. And maybe that was the point. Not that I was unbreakable, but that I had broken and kept going anyway. Now, when I look back, I don't see victory or defeat. I see a fight that never ends. A system that bends only when pushed to the brink. A story that cost me everything and gave me back something I didn't expect. A place in history I never asked for. I walk through the world free but marked, scarred but speaking. And if they come for me again, I'll be ready. Not because I want to be a symbol, but because silence is the only real prison I refuse to serve in ever again. So if you followed this story all the way here, hit like, subscribe, and remember, freedom isn't given, it's taken. And the truth always demands a price.